wonderful to be back at the IFST Spring Conference. I was here 2 years ago in a different venue, but another wonderful conference. So this morning I'm going to be speaking about genetic influences on weight loss, and to ask the question whether this would offer some opportunities to personalise interventions. So let me start with the big picture. And this is analysis done by McKinsey of the global impact of a number of different aspects of society. And you'll see that in terms of impact on global GDP, obesity comes number 3, just behind armed violence, war and terrorism in terms of the impact. So over $2 trillion lost to the world's GDP because of obesity. So clearly an issue we need to do something about. And we know that from a health perspective, losing weight improves health and well-being. And the challenge is, how can we achieve that? How can we do that in ways which are more effective? So just to give you one example of how weight loss really makes a difference, these are data from the DIRECT study, which is a collaboration between the University of Newcastle and Glasgow. A study we undertook in people with type 2 diabetes, the commonest form of diabetes. And what it shows you in the bars is the number of people who were diabetes-free, in whom the diabetes had gone away after a year, according to how much weight they had lost. So the people who had lost at least 15 kilograms, who were 15 kilograms lighter at the end of the year, were 86% less likely to have type 2 diabetes. And it's a great response. The more weight they lost, the more likely the diabetes was to have gone away. The problem is that most weight loss interventions are not so effective. And this was a big analysis published in the British Medical Journal a couple of years ago of more than 40 big trials looking at weight loss and major health outcomes, major diseases, mortality. And you see that on average they achieve just a bit over 3 kilograms of weight loss at a year. So not very effective. And that amount of weight loss would not have done very much about diabetes in the previous trial. But we're now in a new era, and we now have much more information about personal genetics, and this has been used in the world of medicine to personalise and produce what they're calling precision treatments. And there's been a challenge to try to do the same in the world of nutrition and to use genetic information to help us do better. And genetics is one part of this world of personalised nutrition, which you've heard about from 2 of the speakers already this morning. It's not the only part, but it's one part, and it's a bit, I guess, which has probably had the most research attention. So in this presentation I'm going to look at some of the links between genetics and weight loss. And this is because if this would work, if we could use this kind of information, then we could really target intervention to each individual based on genetic information about those individuals. Just last summer, we produced a review paper in the BMJ looking at some of the rationale for taking this kind of personalised approach to the more broader aspect of lifestyle behaviour change. And we categorised 2 types of personalisation. So personalisation, first of all, based on biological evidence of differential responses. So it might be dependent on individual genetics or an individual phenotype. And also personalisation based on a whole range of other individual characteristics, which I'll come back to towards the end of the presentation. We're going to focus most of the presentation on this first one, and particularly on the use of genetics. Now, there's been a number of publications showing relationships between individual genotype and weight loss. And this is just one example where the participants in the study were genotyped for this particular single base change in the gene encoding amylase. And what they saw was that the amount of weight loss after 2 years was related to individual genotype. The problem with many of these studies, this one and many of the other studies, is that there was no obvious mechanism linking that particular gene with the change in body weight. So it's possible it was just a chance observation. So we want to focus much more on where there was good evidence for, good biological evidence for personalizing these kinds of interventions. So our hypothesis was that we could understand genetic susceptibility that makes it easier to gain weight. We might be able to use that same information to help people to lose weight. So we set out to test this hypothesis. So we now look at the evidence. There's lots and lots of genetic variants across the whole of the human genome which are linked with risk of obesity. At the last count, something like 127 different genetic variants scattered across all of our chromosomes. But the one with the biggest effect, the one with the single biggest effect, is for the FTO gene. And there's at least half a dozen different variants of that gene. But this one, at this position, is the one with which is commonest. And if you have the AA version of that gene, then you're likely to be heavier and to have a greater risk of becoming obese. We now know a lot about what that gene encodes. It encodes an enzyme. It actually is an enzyme that removes a methyl group from RNA, and so it's involved in very complex regulation of gene expression. So with a protein which has such a core role in regulating what the cell does, you can understand then that it might be very important for regulation of body weight. And if you have the AA version of this gene, the one that's linked with increased risk of obesity, then you have a higher concentration of ghrelin, the hunger hormone. So your willingness or your capacity to eat is increased. And that might be one of the reasons why FTO is linked with increased weight and risk of obesity. So we set out to test this hypothesis. And the way we did it was to collaborate with a number of other research groups. And we set out to find out whether the different types of FTO influenced the amount of weight that people lost in big-scale, randomized controlled weight loss trials. And we eventually recruited individual level data for almost 10,000 people. So these were people who were in big weight loss trials in whom their genotype had been assessed. We did this very systematically, and we found in the end that there were a total of 11 trials which potentially had this information. For 3 of those trials, we couldn't access the information, either because we couldn't make contact with the researchers or they weren't willing to share the information. But they were 3 very small trials. And all 8 of the large trials shared their data. And the importance of sharing data was we needed information for each individual. It wasn't just enough to know what happened in the whole trial, but we need to link individual weight change with individual genotype. And when we did that, we then were able to measure precisely the effect of the FTO genotype on weight loss. And you see from this forest plot that the answer was very, very clear. And that was, there was absolutely no relationship between FTO genotype and response to weight loss intervention. And in the analysis, we did all the things that epidemiologists love to do. We adjusted for all the kinds of things that could influence the outcome: age, sex, the variable itself at baseline, ethnicity, where the trial was done, the socioeconomic status of the individuals, other things that could influence weight loss like physical activity and smoking. And when we did all of that, there was absolutely no effect on weight loss. And we did that for weight itself and for waist circumference. and very similar findings. We also looked at how the trials had been run in terms of what kind of intervention it was. Some trials were just trials of diet alone, some used diet and exercise. They were of different duration, but again, the findings were unaffected by intervention characteristics, and they were unaffected by participant characteristics. So our conclusion was that there was a robust evidence of a lack of effect of FTO genotype on weight loss. So this meant that the hypothesis had no support. So even if carrying the FTO genotype makes it more likely you gain weight, the good news is it's no impediment to losing weight. And even if you have the risk allele, you can lose weight at just the same rate as those lucky people who don't have the risk allele. So at least for FTO, genetics does not control the rate at which you lose weight. Now, since we did that trial, which we published just under 2 years ago, there's been another large trial, the Diet Fit study, which was run in America. And this was a trial testing 2 different kinds of weight loss treatment, a low-fat approach and a low-carbohydrate approach. And across this trial, there was absolutely no difference at the end of 12 months in the amount of weight, on average, that people lost on a low-carb or a low-fat diet. We weren't much interested in that. We were interested in variation. So what was it that meant that some people lost a lot of weight? These individual bars are the individual people in the trial. 609 people. And you see that some lucky people lost up to 30 kilograms of weight in those 12 months, whereas some people lost no weight, and some people actually gained some weight. And we were interested in that inter-individual variation and trying to understand whether there was a genetic component and whether that would be helpful in the future. So the key questions were, what's the biological or genetic basis for this inter-individual variation? And if we understood that, could we then use that knowledge to intervene more effectively? So in the Diet Fits trial, the researchers had investigated 3 different genotypes. These are the genes PPAR gamma, ADRB2, and FABBP2. For the purposes of this lecture, it doesn't really matter what those genes are, but they were relevant genes to have investigated. And so the researchers, Chris Gardner and his colleagues, were able to use that genotype-based information to investigate the variability in weight loss. So they collected the people together according to their genotype. So these, in this table, are all the possible genotypes of the individuals in the trial. And they grouped them according to those that would be predicted to be more sensitive to the low-fat diet, or predicted to be more sensitive to the low-carbohydrate diet, or to be, where genes would be irrelevant to the type of diet. And then they looked at weight loss trajectories in relation to genotype. And they were very similar. There was no relationship between genotype and the amount of weight that people lost. And there was no interactions between genotype and the particular type of intervention, whether it was low fat or low carbohydrate. Again, providing evidence that genotype was no impediment to losing weight. So far, I think there's very limited information that there's a genetic basis for explaining inter-individual differences in weight loss. But that's still an active area of research, and I think we probably will learn more. And the area which I think might be particularly important is not to look at the genes which are related to obesity, but to look at a completely different area of physiology, to look at the genes which are related to things like attention, memory, reward, and motivation, which are important when you're trying to lose weight. So I think the genetic side of this has been looking in the wrong place so far. This is all part of an emerging area of science called behavioral genetics. It's not yet strong in the human biology area. It's very strong in some areas of model organisms, in flatworms like C. elegans and so on, where the model is very simple. They're using these kind of approaches. And I can see that 5-10 years down the road, we'll be translating that into human biology. So now I want to turn more to the second area, and that is, if we don't have enough information yet on the biological side, is there more we can do on this side in understanding more about the individual's other characteristics, which would help us to develop and implement more effective behavior change? What I've finished then with is this conceptual diagram in which we're suggesting ways in which all of these ideas might be put together to develop more effective weight loss interventions. So understanding more about the individuals themselves, that might be biological, it might be many other things. It's information about barriers and facilitators to behavior change. It's knowing something about the individual aspirations of the people who are taking part in the study, and using all that information in evidence-based and systematic ways. And at the moment, I think we have very little understanding of how to use that kind of information in evidence-based and systematic ways to develop personalised intervention. So I think this is where there's a big research gap. If we have good personalised interventions, then we need to link those with self-monitoring systems, the kind of gadgets we have on phones or other digital devices, which can provide each of us with information on how we're doing. And that information then can be fed back into the cycle to produce better personalised interventions, so that we have a virtuous cycle, which leads eventually to improved weight loss and better health and well-being. So with that, I've finished and summarised what I've covered. I've shown you that there's excellent evidence that genotype contributes to obesity risk, at least 127 different genetic variants that contribute to our obesity risk. However, those genetic variants that we've studied so far that increase susceptibility to obesity do not prove to be impediments to weight loss. That's good news. There's a lack of knowledge of the genetic determinants of behaviour change, and that I think is a big area for future research. And if we understand this better, then we may be able to personalise interventions that improve behaviour change and improve health and well-being. Thank you very much.